Welcome to our channel, where unforgettable stories come to life. We're so glad you're here today. Before we jump into this incredible story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Your feedback makes this community so much more exciting. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. We've got something even more special coming tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now let's dive in and enjoy today's tale together. A group of tourists tied a Royal Guardsman to a lamppost. Then this happened. The morning air was crisp, with a faint mist swirling through Trafalgar Square. It was the kind of morning that seemed almost frozen in time. Standing tall and immovable at his post, a Royal Guardsman, Sergeant Alex Dawson, looked like a figure, carved from stone. His red uniform fit him perfectly, emphasizing his athletic build, and the tall bearskin cap perched atop his head only accentuated his imposing stature. His boots, gleaming with meticulous polish, reflected the world around him, a world bustling with tourists, camera clicks, and excited chatter. Yet amidst the noise and movement, he stood completely still, embodying the very definition of discipline. The crowd around him buzzed like a hive. People laughed and chattered, snapping photos, eager to capture the moment. Among them, a group of 3 men stood out. They were different from the rest, not just because of their size, but because of the air of cocky arrogance that surrounded them. Tall, muscular, with confident grins plastered across their faces, the group seemed to take up more space than their physical presence suggested. Their leader, a burly man in his mid-30s, with a square jaw and a backward cap, laughed louder than anyone else. He was clearly drunk, his steps a little unsteady, but his bravado was undeniable. "Hey, soldier boy," the leader yelled, his voice cutting through the chatter of the crowd. "Smile for the camera, or don't they pay you enough for that?" His friends laughed, and their laughter echoed through the square. The leader's voice was so loud it drew the attention of other tourists, some of whom turned to watch. His companions, both wearing tight t-shirts adorned with Union Jack prints, joined in, clearly enjoying their newfound attention. As the leader of the group laughed and taunted the guardsman, the crowd shifted, a few people taking notice of the growing scene. One man from the crowd, who had been quietly observing, shouted, "Hey, you're not supposed to go there." But the leader, drunk on his own confidence, ignored the warning and smirked at the man. "Relax," he said. "We're just having a bit of fun." But fun was not on the guardsman's mind. Sergeant Dawson remained motionless, his face as calm as ever, betraying no emotion. His eyes, cold and steady, never left their fixed point. He was trained for moments like this, trained to ignore the taunts, the jabs, and the disruptions. His silence, however, seemed to encourage the tourists' antics. It was almost as if they believed that his stillness was weakness, that his calm was an invitation to push further. "Seriously, you won't even blink?" The leader sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "What a bore," one of his companions chimed in, laughing loudly. "I bet he's a robot," another added, and their laughter filled the square. The guardsman didn't flinch. He didn't move an inch, not even to acknowledge their comments. His silence seemed to speak volumes, but the group of tourists, emboldened by alcohol and their own audacity, were only driven further by it. They were testing the limits, daring him to respond. "Let's see how he reacts when we get close," the leader said with a grin, stepping forward and crossing the white line that marked the boundary around the guardsman's post. The boundary was a symbol of order, a line that was not meant to be crossed, but the leader ignored it, clearly seeking to escalate the situation. A few people in the crowd began to murmur, some shaking their heads in disapproval, but no one stepped in to stop them. The group was too big, too loud, and they seemed untouchable in their drunken arrogance. One of the tourists, with a smug grin, moved closer to the guardsman, getting right in his face. "What's it like, huh? Standing here all day like a statue?" he mocked, leaning in closer. Still, the guardsman didn't move. His posture was impeccable. His eyes locked forward, his body stiff with resolve. And yet, in his silence, in his absolute control, He exuded an undeniable power that no amount of mockery could break. The leader of the group raised his hand, as if to touch the guardsman's bearskin cap, but hesitated for a brief moment. Something flickered in his eyes, a hint of uncertainty. But it was quickly replaced by a sneer, and with a final shrug, he decided to push further. "Come on, man," he said loudly, turning to his friends. "The show must go on." And with that, the moment of reckoning was about to begin. The tourists, emboldened by the laughter of the crowd and the alcohol coursing through their veins, had crossed a line. What began as taunting, playful banter quickly turned into something darker. The leader of the group, intoxicated and emboldened by his own bravado, was now clearly pushing for more. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to break the guardsman's stoic composure, to prove that even the most disciplined soldier could be cracked. But Sergeant Dawson stood there, unmoving, his face as expressionless as the stone lion statues around the square. "Come on, soldier boy," the leader taunted again, his voice rising. "Smile for the camera, don't you ever have any fun?" He stepped forward, hands outstretched, and before anyone could react, he crossed the white line. The line that marked the boundaries of the guard's post, off limits to tourists. A few members of the crowd muttered their disapproval. "Hey, you're not supposed to be that close," someone shouted, but the leader just waved them off. "Relax," he sneered. "We're just having a laugh. It's all in good fun." His friends laughed along, their voices full of arrogance, but the tension was mounting. The crowd started to pull back a little, unsure of what was happening. Phones were still raised, but now, some people exchanged uneasy glances. They sensed the situation was starting to shift from harmless fun to something more serious. The guardsman, unmoving as ever, didn't react. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, and he certainly didn't break his posture. His silence and stillness were a powerful contrast to the growing noise and chaos around him. It only seemed to infuriate the leader more. He wasn't used to being ignored. To him, the stillness of the guardsman was an invitation to push harder. "Come on, man. You're a statue. Don't you even feel anything?" The leader's words cut through the air, and for a split second there was a flicker in the eyes of the guardsman. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Seriously," the leader continued, pacing around the guardsman. "How do you do it? No fun, no emotions, just standing there like a machine." His voice was taunting, mocking the very foundation of what the guardsman stood for. And still, the soldier did not move, did not respond. Then, the leader had an idea. He turned to his friends, with a mischievous grin. "Let's see how he reacts to something more exciting," he said, his voice dripping with mean-spirited intent. He waved at the others to join him. The three tourists moved closer, surrounding the guardsmen like vultures closing in on their prey. They were drunk, overconfident, and oblivious to the gravity of the situation. One of them, a tall, blond man with a cocky smirk, pulled out his phone, clearly thinking this was all a joke. He began making exaggerated faces in front of the guardsman, striking ridiculous poses and blowing kisses to the motionless soldier. Laughter erupted from his friends. A few people in the crowd giggled, thinking it was all part of a performance. But the more they laughed, the more uncomfortable the onlookers became. "Let's see if he's even alive or just a statue," the tourist mocked, leaning in close as though inspecting the guardsman's face. The others snickered. The tourists were now emboldened by the crowd's confused amusement, yet no one stepped. The guardsman remained still, his eyes locked forward, his face expressionless. But that stillness, that lack of reaction, was beginning to feel like a challenge. One of the tourists, now feeling empowered by the scene, leaned in even closer. The laughter of the group grew louder as they crossed the invisible boundary, stepping beyond what was acceptable. One of the men, with a mischievous grin, reached out to touch the guardsman's bearskin cap, daring to break the rules of protocol. The movement was fast, but the hesitation was palpable in his eyes. He knew, on some level, that he was about to cross a serious line. But the bravado of alcohol and his friends egging him on gave him the confidence to push forward. The leader of the group now stood directly in front of the guardsman, his face just inches away. "You're here for us, right?" he said loudly, turning to his friends with a broad, mocking smile. The rest of the tourists had now surrounded the guardsman, their phones recording the scene, their laughter filling the air. They felt unstoppable. The crowd had become their audience. But something had changed. The guardsman's stillness was no longer just a symbol of discipline. It had become a silent force, a force that was about to make its presence felt. The tension in the air was thick now. The tourists, once full of loud confidence, seemed to feel a subtle shift. Their mockery had gone too far. What began as a harmless joke had spiraled into something that was no longer funny. Yet, they were too deep in their own arrogance to back down. They were drunk on both alcohol and the growing attention of the crowd, but now, with each passing moment, they could feel the eyes of the onlookers weighing on them. Something about the stillness of the guardsman, the way he never flinched, was beginning to unnerve them. The leader, still determined to push the limits, stepped forward once again, his bravado hanging by a thread. "Come on, soldier boy," he sneered, moving closer to the guardsman. "We're just having fun. Where's your sense of humor? Let's see if you can move now, huh?" His words rang out, loud enough to carry over the growing murmurs of the crowd. But there was no reply. From the guardsman, no change in his posture. He remained perfectly still, his eyes locked ahead, his face a mask of unwavering calm. And that's when it happened. The leader, growing frustrated by the lack of reaction, took another step forward, crossing the line yet again. His hand reached out, aiming for the guardsman's bearskin cap. For a moment there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a moment of doubt. But it was quickly replaced by a smirk. He thought perhaps he could get a reaction. He thought for a moment that the soldier might finally crack. But still the guardsman didn't move. His eyes, cold and piercing beneath the shadow of his cap, remained fixed. The leader's smirk widened as he pulled his hand back, deciding to escalate once again. "Let's see how he looks next to a lamppost," he called to his friends, his voice filled with a mock seriousness that only served to fuel the tension further. The group of tourists exchanged glances, as if daring each other to take things further. Their laughter had died down, replaced by a nervous excitement that hung in the air like static. Some of the onlookers, now sensing the growing unease, shifted uncomfortably. One person in the crowd even began recording the scene, but no one stepped in to stop what was unfolding. Without hesitation, one of the tourists moved forward. He took the guardsman's arm, pulling it roughly from its perfect position. The crowd gasped, but the guardsman did not flinch. His muscles tensed slightly beneath his uniform, but his face remained as calm as ever. He was bound by the protocol of his training, unable to actively resist. The crowd, now on edge, murmured amongst themselves, some shouting for them to stop. But the tourists were oblivious, their drunken laughter filling the square as they continued their game. The leader stepped back and with a wide grin shouted to the group, "All right, boys, let's see how he feels about being part of the city's decor." His words hung in the air, audacious and taunting, as if he were the one in control of the situation. The tourists, now emboldened by their apparent success, began to move in a coordinated effort. They grabbed the guardsman's shoulders, holding him firm while one of them dashed off to retrieve a thick rope from his bag. Before the onlookers could fully process what was happening, the guardsman was being tied to the lamppost. The sight was jarring, an embodiment of British discipline reduced to an object of mockery in the eyes of the tourists. The crowd froze, some gasping, others in shock, but no one stepped forward to stop it. Phones continued to record the scene, capturing every humiliating second. The leader stepped back, proudly surveying his handiwork. "There we go," he said, smiling triumphantly as he snapped a picture with his phone. "Now he's part of the city's decor." But even in this humiliating position, the guardsman held himself with dignity. His face remained impassive, his eyes betraying nothing but quiet resolve. The only sign of effort was the slight tension in his muscles, the strain it took to remain motionless, even in the face of this public ridicule. The crowd was divided. Some laughed, while others shouted in support of the guardsman, urging the tourists to stop. But the trio continued, oblivious to the growing anger of the people around them. And then, just as the situation seemed to reach a boiling point, the unmistakable sound of horses' hooves rang through the square. The rhythmic clatter cut through the tension, and the tourists froze. The crowd, sensing a change, went silent. The laughter died down, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation. As the sound grew louder, the source became clear, too royal. Guards on horseback, dressed in immaculate uniforms, appeared from around the corner. The tourists stood frozen, their earlier bravado melting away. One of the mounted guards spoke first, his voice booming across the square. "Step away from—" The guardsman immediately. The words were clear, authoritative, and filled with undeniable power. The leader of the group, still trying to cling to his confidence, laughed nervously. "Come on, guys," he said, raising his hands in a mock surrender. "We're just having some fun." But his laughter faded as the situation quickly turned, from one of ridicule to one of confrontation. The tourists, their arrogance still high, stood there, frozen for a moment. The arrival of the two royal guards on horseback had shattered the tension that had been mounting. The sound of hooves, steady and deliberate, had cut through the air like a warning, and the tourists suddenly found themselves confronted by the very authority they had mocked. The leader of the group, his face now pale from the sudden shift in energy, tried to laugh it off, but the nervousness was evident in his voice. "Come on, guys," he said, his words more of a plea than a statement. "We're just having a bit of fun. No harm done, right?" But his voice lacked the confidence it had held just moments earlier. The situation had changed, and they all knew it. The crowd, once amused, had now fallen silent, watching with bated breath as the two guards on horseback loomed over the square, their eyes cold and unwavering. The leader's bravado was quickly crumbling as he realized the gravity of what he had done. One of the mounted guards spoke again, his voice booming with authority. "Step away from the guardsman immediately," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The tourists, once so full of confidence, now seemed small in comparison to the towering figures of the guards, who seemed to emanate an almost regal sense of power. The leader, desperate to salvage his fading control, raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender, attempting to keep his composure. "Relax, man, we were just joking around," he said, chuckling nervously. But the guards didn't budge. Their stares were fixed, unflinching, and the seriousness in the air was palpable. The crowd remained silent, their eyes darting between the tourists and the guards, sensing the rising tension. At that moment, 3 more guards appeared from behind the horses, marching with military precision. Their faces were grim, and the halberds in their hands gleamed in the morning light. The crowd's murmur grew louder, and someone whispered, "Now things are about to get interesting." The leader of the tourists tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the steady march of the guards. "It was just a joke," he stammered, now looking completely out of his depth. One of the guards, a tall man with a strong jawline and a serious expression, stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "You are violating the law by disrespecting the symbols of the kingdom," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable threat. "Release him immediately, or you will be detained." The tourists, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, exchanged nervous glances. The leader, still attempting to hold on to his sense of control, hurriedly stammered, "We didn't mean any harm. It was all in good fun." His words hung in the air, but they lacked conviction. The truth had become clear to him now. He was no longer in charge of the situation. Then, in a moment that would change everything, the guardsman who had been tied to the lamppost spoke. His voice was quiet, but it rang with undeniable authority. "Your fun dishonors what I stand for," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. The crowd reacted immediately, whispers spreading quickly. Phones, previously pointed at the tourists, now focused on the guardsman. His calm words, delivered with unwavering dignity, had hit the crowd with the force of a shockwave. The leader of the group, his bravado completely gone, took a step back, his face drained of color. The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He had crossed a line he didn't understand, and now, standing before him, was a soldier who had upheld the values of discipline and respect, even in the face of humiliation. The horsemen, their commands unwavering, repeated, "Release him now." The tourists, who had thought they were untouchable, now scrambled to untie the guardsman, their faces pale with fear and regret. The crowd, once silent, now erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the square. It wasn't just applause for the guardsman's resilience. It was applause for the respect that had been restored in the face of brazen disrespect. As the final knot was untied, the guardsman straightened, adjusting his uniform and ensuring his cap remained perfectly in place. He gave no further attention to the tourists, who were now utterly humiliated. They had been exposed for their ignorance and arrogance. The guardsman returned to his post without a word, his stance as perfect as it had been before. The horsemen, now satisfied that the situation was under control, turned their attention back to the crowd. "The Royal Guard always upholds dignity," one of them said, his voice carrying over the square. "I hope you all understand what that means." The tourists, their faces red with shame, began to back away. One of them shoved his hands into his pockets, trying to avoid eye contact. The leader, his shoulders slumped, was the first to turn and flee. His companions, equally ashamed, followed close behind. The crowd, once filled with uneasy silence, now burst into laughter and cheers. Phones were raised, recording the fleeing tourists as they ran from the scene they had created. The guardsman, unfazed by the commotion, stood tall once again. His dignity had never faltered, even in the face of humiliation. As he returned to his post, the crowd cheered and the tourists faded into the distance, their disgrace captured forever on film. The moment had gone viral. The world would see what had transpired that day, and it would be a reminder of the quiet strength that could never be shaken. The tourists, now fully aware that the situation had spiraled far beyond their control, stood, frozen. Their bravado had evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of panic. The leader, once full of arrogant confidence, now stood in front of the guardsman, his face pale and his body tense. The reality of the situation had set in. They had crossed a line they hadn't even realized existed, and now, standing before them, were the very enforcers of British tradition, Royal Guards, unshakable in their discipline and honor. The crowd, which had once been cheering on the tourists' antics, had fallen silent, their attention now entirely on the unfolding drama. Some whispered in disbelief, others began to record, and a few exchanged glances, all sensing that something monumental was happening. The mood had shifted completely. What was once a scene of laughter and mockery had transformed into a tense confrontation, and the tourists were on the losing side of it. The leader, desperately trying to hold on to some semblance of control, muttered, "It was just a joke, man. We didn't mean any harm." His voice cracked slightly, a far cry from the taunting sneers he had thrown at the guardsmen moments ago. But the mounted guards didn't seem interested in his excuses. They were there to uphold tradition and order. The leader's words fell flat in the face of the gravity of his actions. One of the Royal Guardsmen, a tall man with an expression carved from stone, stepped forward and raised his hand, signaling for the tourist to stop talking. His voice, calm and unwavering, broke through the tension. "You are violating the law by disrespecting symbols of the kingdom," he said, his tone stern and final. "Release him immediately, or you will be detained." The words landed with the weight of authority. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, let out a soft murmur. The tourists' defiant smiles were gone, replaced by wide-eyed fear. Realizing they were cornered, the tourists, now fully aware of the mistake they had made, began to scramble. The leader, his face flushed with embarrassment and fear, hurriedly turned to untie the rope that held the guardsman to the lamppost. His hands shook as he fumbled with the knot. One of his companions, similarly rattled, stepped forward to help, But the damage had already been done. The guardsman, still standing tall, his uniform immaculate, showed no sign of anger or frustration. His face remained calm, expressionless, but his eyes told a different story. There was a quiet fury in them, a sense of betrayal not just for himself, but for the very institution he represented. He had endured the mockery, the humiliation, and the assault on his dignity, but through it all he had maintained the discipline that defined him. As the rope was finally untied, the leader of the tourists stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. His bravado was gone. In its place was the unmistakable shame of being exposed as nothing more than a bully who had underestimated the power of respect and tradition. "You will now face the consequences of your actions," the Royal Guardsman said softly, his voice firm, yet controlled. His words were not a threat, but a statement of fact. The leader, still stumbling to regain his composure, looked up at the guardsman, his face a mask of shame. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. The reality of what had just happened, the force of his own humiliation, was too overwhelming. At that moment, the leader's desperate attempt at an apology was cut short by a voice that echoed through the square. "The Royal Guard always upholds dignity," one of the mounted guards said, his voice steady and unyielding. The crowd, sensing the finality of the moment, erupted into applause. The tourists, their heads lowered, looked like children caught in a transgression they could no longer deny. The guardsman, freed from his restraints, stood still for a moment longer before adjusting his uniform, making sure his bearskin cap was still perched perfectly atop his head. With a final glance at the tourists, he returned to his post as though nothing had happened. The guards on horseback moved in closer, encircling the tourists with precision. "Detain them," one of the horsemen ordered, his voice sharp. The tourists, now fully aware of their fate, started to back away. Their bravado completely evaporated. One of the men, panic-stricken, shoved his hands into his pockets while the leader, pale and shaking, turned to run. His friends, equally scared, followed suit, pushing through the crowd, desperately trying to escape the consequences of their actions. As they sprinted away, the crowd, which had been silent only moments before, erupted into laughter and applause. Some shouted words of disapproval, others captured the fleeing tourists on their phones. The guardsman, completely unaffected by the chaos around him, stood motionless once again, his posture as impeccable as ever. His dignity had never faltered. The tourists, on the other hand, had learned a hard lesson in respect, and it was one they would never forget. What do you think of this shocking turn of events? Do you think the tourists went too far with their disrespect, or was it just a harmless joke that escalated too quickly? It's incredible to see how the Royal Guardsman maintained his composure, upholding his dignity in the face of such humiliation. But what about the tourists? Did they truly learn their lesson, or were they just caught in the moment? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, and what you think of the guardsman's unwavering strength and the tourists' actions. Have you ever witnessed something like this, where someone's pride and arrogance led them to a hard lesson in respect? Share your experiences or your thoughts on how discipline and self-control can sometimes be the most powerful responses to disrespect. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss out on our future stories. We've got more incredible moments coming your way tomorrow, and trust us, you won't want to miss it. Let's keep the conversation going and explore more of these unforgettable stories together.